Man, that's every week of our lives, but we frame it in that this week is what's important relative to that. It's not a realistic discussion unless we handle business this week. And so that's what I mean when I say each week we're singularly focused. It's not like we don't acknowledge the elephant in the room. There's something that's coming at the end of this thing, and we want to be positioned for it. And so we know what this week means relative to it.
Mike Tomlin on the concept of the playoffs still being in play for a Steelers team that started out 3-7 and one that is now 5-7. I suppose that's possible if you believe that the AFC is going to come back to the Steelers, and if the Steelers can actually win at least 4 of their remaining 5, or maybe even 5 in a row. I can certainly believe in that first thing. No way I believe in that second thing. I am Tim Benz. This is the Pittsburgh CityCast. It's brought to you by BetRivers. Download the app today or go to BetRivers.com. The Steelers are plus 6,600 to win the AFC North right now. If you believe that the Steelers can honestly make the playoffs at this point at 5-7 with 5 games remaining, that's not at all a bad bet. If you could believe that they can make the playoffs, they're probably going to have to do it through the division and not the wild card, because they're 0-4 against the entire AFC East, all of whom are currently in the playoff race. The Steelers have the Ravens twice, without Lamar Jackson in all likelihood for this week. For the first of those games, we'll see about the second game. The Steelers are at minus 2.5 at BetRivers for Sunday's game at Acrisure Stadium, and I'll take that bet. Tyler Huntley does nothing for me, and the Steelers' great weakness these days is also the Ravens' greatest weakness. Baltimore keeps blowing big leads. The Steelers have trouble maintaining leads after halftime. So if the Steelers can just be within 1 score at the end of the second quarter, I like their chances. The Steelers also have the Panthers, Raiders, and Browns with Deshaun Watson. I see the Steelers losing that Raiders game. They're playing well all of a sudden, Las Vegas is, and the Steelers always stink against the Raiders no matter the circumstances. Much better Steeler teams have lost to significantly worse Raiders teams in the recent years. Everyone will assume a win for the Steelers on Christmas Eve. Derek Carr usually shreds the Steelers. The Raiders win that one, I think. That probably will then sap whatever division chances the Steelers have. Then it'll come down to tiebreakers for wild cards, and the Steelers already have 6 conference losses. That would be 7, so I think they're still screwed. But because the Steelers are playing better, and because the schedule stinks, and because Jackson is hurt and Watson looked blah on Sunday for Cleveland against Houston, I get the optimism. It was kind of funny to read dueling projections on the internet about the Steelers down the stretch. On the one hand, Dan Graziano of ESPN, he's playing the optimism card. He said of Tomlin avoiding a losing season yet again for what would be a 16th consecutive year. Quote, "All right, he's got me. I'm not ready to say he'll do it, but I think you have to at least acknowledge the possibility." The only loss the Steelers have in their past 4 games was very close to the Bengals, who were as good as any team in the league in November. Pittsburgh's remaining games are against the Ravens, Carolina, home for the Raiders, at Baltimore, and home against the Browns. So you're telling me that they can't go 4-1 or 3-1-1 against that schedule, especially if Lamar Jackson isn't playing for the Ravens? I've reached the point where I'm no longer comfortable telling Tomlin what he can't do. That was my bad. Well, okay, Dan, understood. There's logic in that. But let's not declare victory there just yet, not only in the sense that if Tomlin comes up short, let's avoid remembering 2022 as close but no cigar, okay? Let's also remember that in 10 of those 12 seasons leading up to this one, there have been no playoff victories, and it'll be 6 of 13 missing the playoffs entirely if they don't get in this season. But I get where Graziano is coming from, even if it's sort of prisoner of the moment type of stuff. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Chihada of NFL.com, he said of the Steelers, the man has gone 15 years without a losing season. He has a 5-7 team that needs to win 4 of its last 5 games for that streak to continue to 16. That's not going to happen. That's not a knock on Tomlin. It's just reality that the Steelers will see the Ravens twice, the Browns and the Raiders before the season ends. Sure, there are a lot of questions about those teams, but they're all better than Pittsburgh right now. To be honest, it was stunning that Tomlin dragged a weak Steelers squad into the postseason in 2021. The Steelers are still mathematically alive in the postseason race, but they're about to start fading fast. I disagree with Jeffrey there, especially in the sense that it's sort of stated fact that all those teams are better than the Steelers. I don't know that they are. I think the Steelers are bad, but I think all those teams are bad too. I also disagree in the sense that I actually think the Steelers are playing better than they have all year in these 4 games coming out of the bye. I think the schedule stinks. So I don't see a fade coming fast like he said. I see reason for the opposite. It's just that when the Steelers come up in conversation, my optimism is couched because there's always that inevitable, annual, unavoidable, where did that come from, how did that happen kind of loss that the Steelers will eventually have that ruins everything. I mean, go back to the Raiders point. I could completely envision the Steelers winning against Baltimore and the Panthers, getting to 7-7, being on the playoff cusp, then losing to the Raiders on immaculate reception night to sap all the momentum, even if all the national analysts can't see it happening that way. I certainly can, because I've seen it so many times before against that team in this era. By the way, since we're talking about the odds, the Ravens are currently minus money to win the division at minus 134, with Jackson likely out 1 to 3 weeks. I can't see how that's possible. I can't see how that's the case. The Bengals have a tough schedule. I get it. They host Cleveland this week, and they host the Ravens at the end of the season. In between, they're in Tampa and in New England, and they host the Bills. It's not easy. I get it. But they just beat Tennessee on the road and the Chiefs as well, so they're plus 120 to win the division. Meanwhile, the Ravens have the Falcons, the Steelers twice, the Browns, perhaps still without Lamar in that game, and the Bengals. Give me Cincy at plus 120 to win the AFC North. Okay, let's stick with the Steelers for the time being. The over-under in that game between Baltimore and Pittsburgh is at 37. That feels absurdly low for an NFL game. My first thought when I saw this game was it was likely going to be 19-16 Steelers, so that's an under. I'll stay away from the total and just go with the Steelers at minus 2.5. I feel like if you go under 37 in an NFL game, the odds are so stacked against you. That's such a tough putt. You're going to white-knuckle that to the last possession. If you play it over, you give yourself at least a little wiggle room for a fluky play or two. Getting nothing again from George Pickens, that sure could help the under, though. 1 catch, 2 yards. I thought the guy was going to have a big game against Atlanta. I was dead wrong on that one. So much for that. I'm sure Mike Tomlin, as the head coach of the Steelers, thought he was simply supporting George Pickens on Tuesday when he turned a deaf ear to criticism of his rookie wide receiver. But in doing so, I'm not sure if Tomlin realized that he's also turning a blind eye to the needs of his rookie quarterback in Kenny Pickett. Pickens took some fan and media heat for sulking on the bench during the Steelers' win Sunday over the Falcons. Then he got even more criticism for demonstrably complaining about not getting the ball later in the game. So Pickens winds up with just 1 catch for 2 yards in the contest overall, and this is what Tomlin had to say about the way he was acting on the sidelines as a result during the game.
I'd rather say woe than sick 'em. I want a guy that wants to be a significant part of what it is that we do. Now, the appropriate and professional and mature way to express that, we're growing and working on, and we will continue. But that spirit, that competitive spirit, the guy that wants the ball, I want that guy. You know, I'd imagine TJ wants to lay the quarterback down more. We got competitors. This is professional football. These guys know that they have to deliver. And so for a guy that wants to do that, I'm not going to make that a negative, no matter how silly I think the commentary is or people talking about him expressing frustrations and stuff and trying to make it a negative storyline. I laugh at that. Again, that's one of the reasons why we're continually progressing, because we're capable of tuning that BS out.
Well, gee, for a guy who's tuning out all that BS, Tomlin sure appears to have heard a lot of it, huh? Here's something else I wish he heard, though. Complaints from his quarterbacks about exactly that kind of behavior weeks ago. Remember, after the loss to New England in Week 2, Mitch Trubisky talked about too many people calling for the ball and carping about play calls in the huddle. Then shortly after Pickett took over the starting job, he was asked about that issue and said, I just like a clean huddle. I want everybody to hear the call. I want everybody to be on their P's and Q's of what they have to do. I don't want to come back and hear a guy say he didn't hear it because they were talking and stuff like that. So imagine how hard that is to do if Pickens is yapping in one of Pickett's ears and Deontay Johnson is griping in the other. Maybe those two are saving their exasperation for sideline temper tantrums and media grumbling, but if Tomlin is going to enable Pickens like that publicly, what's preventing him from taking his discontent to the huddle? Tomlin can default to that old, reliable, I'd rather say whoa and sick 'em trope all he wants, but that's usually better served when describing a guy who's occasionally a little too aggressive, carrying a block beyond the echo of the whistle. In this case, Tomlin shouldn't have to say whoa or sick 'em. He shouldn't have to say anything because Pickens shouldn't be saying anything at all in the first place. He's a rookie. He has one 100-yard game to his credit. Get open, be quiet, and the ball will find you. As a fellow first-year player, don't make Pickett's job harder than it already is. As narcissistic as Antonio Brown was, at least he waited until he had a few 1,000-yard seasons under his belt until he turned into a diva. And at least when he was spouting off about not getting the ball against the Ravens in 2017, when he was throwing the Gatorade cooler all over the place, he was doing it with a 13-year veteran quarterback in Ben Roethlisberger commanding the huddle, and that guy could feel comfortable tuning out his noise. Pickett, though, is a rookie. He's still feeling out this whole NFL routine. On his podcast this week, Ben Roethlisberger outlined how it was obvious that Pickett threw a pass to Pickens after he was spotted on the sidelines pouting just to keep him happy. Roethlisberger could do that stuff with more of a decade of experience under his belt, but it's the last thing in the world Pickett should have to worry about. And to be fair to Trubisky, he never should have had to be burdened by it either 2 weeks into quarterbacking a brand new team. Tomlin can laugh at criticism of Pickens all he wants, as he just said, but the criticism is valid. It's valid because there's on-field, actual football residue to this conversation. It's not just about defending Pickens, his image, or his reputation. If complaints from Pickens, and maybe Johnson, are the kinds of things that could negatively impact the execution of this offense that usually struggles in the first place, and impact Pickett's ability to command the huddle, then sorry, Mike, it's time to say whoa. If Pickens wants the ball, let him sick him in the other team's secondary. Then the ball will find him soon enough, trust me. All right, on to college football. The Georgia Bulldogs are minus 152 favorites to win the college football playoff. The TCU Horned Frogs plus 1,600 long shots. Michigan plus 200 to win, and Ohio State plus 350. The fact that Ohio State is only plus 350 to win the playoff and the team seated in front of them, TCU, is just proof of what I talked about yesterday when they're plus 1,600. That's just what we were talking about at the Mark Madden show yesterday, that the committee knowingly manipulated the seedings to avoid having Michigan play Ohio State in the first round of the playoff in the national semifinals, and to me that's a joke. Both OSU and Texas Christian have one loss. They both lost their most recent game. Neither is a conference champion now, and the eye test tells us all year that the Buckeyes deserve to be ranked in front of the Horned Frogs from week to week. Yet when the final rankings appear, TCU maintained its third ranking after falling to Kansas State in the Big 12 title game. So go figure. The team that gets hurt the most by that result, ironically, is Georgia at number 1. As the top seed, the Bulldogs shouldn't have to draw the toughest opponent. And in terms of raw talent and skill and depth, that's probably still OSU, even though they're the 4th seed. This is a fault that will, I think, be avoided come 2024 in the sense that when they go to the 12-team playoff, the top 4 won't be able to play each other until the semifinals. Something fluky could happen, though, where the top seed is always going to get the 8 or 9 seed in the quarterfinals, and seeds 2 through 4 may get a double-digit upset winner out of the byes in the second round. So theoretically, yes, in 2024, I suppose, the best-seeded team, the number 1 team, could still wind up with a tougher opponent, but you know what? That happens in college basketball all the time. If it's me, I'd reseed after every round. Another complaint is that under the current model, the conference championship games seem like useless annoyances. In the case of Georgia, Michigan, and TCU, apparently there's no risk in losing at all, especially since TCU didn't slip after its defeat, so why would Georgia or Michigan have slipped? They wouldn't have. Maybe if Michigan had won and Georgia had lost, the number 1 seed could have changed hands and gone to Michigan. I guess that could have happened. But would the voters have just made TCU then the 4 anyway to avoid an Ohio State-Michigan rematch in that scenario too? Yeah, they probably would have. At least in the new format, the 2024 format. And I've come around and modified my opinion on this after some careful thought. The top 4 seeds are given exclusively to conference champions. So the conference championship games would mean a lot more. They get buys. So not only would Clemson out of the ACC and Utah out of the Pac-12 be in the bracket come 2024, they get a bye as well. They'd be the 3 and 4 seeds respectively, since they would be the 3rd and 4th highest rated conference champions. And that new system, it's going to be flawed too. It'll be far from perfect. Fans will kvetch over teams such as Clemson and Utah being overseeded. We already talked about going in with a hard bracket instead of reseeding. And financially, some schools may actually prefer to be a 5 to 8 seed so they can host a first-round playoff game, whereas teams 1 through 4 don't get to suit up until games move to a neutral venue. Then, per usual, you got the Notre Dame question. They never would face the hurdle of needing to win a conference title, but if they finish the regular season 12-0, they'd also never have the chance to get a top 4 seed at a bye without claiming a conference championship if they're not in a conference. Although if history has taught us anything, if there's a way to benefit, Notre Dame will figure it out. Those problems seem less galling to me, though. Also arguing who should be the 7th at-large team that gets left out in 2024 versus the 4th team, including all the conference champions in the 2022 season, the current model. That seems like a significantly lesser issue to me. So I embrace the 12-team format. It's more inclusive than the 4-team model, if somewhat watered down. 8 would be cleaner and more elite, I think. 6 teams, which would be just the Power 5 conference champions and the top-ranked group of 5 reps. 6 teams, which is 2 byes and 4 other conference champs battling it out in the first round with seeds 3 through 6. That model puts the most emphasis on being deserving. It's also the most punitive, though, if an elite team has just one bad game in a conference championship. But to that point, hey, West Virginia 2007, 13-9, tough. Don't blow it late then. But it's only taken us, a century or so to get this far? Maybe we'll get closer to perfect during the next 100 years. All right, finally, hockey. I called the under on the Mark Madden show last night for Pens and Blue Jackets. My logic didn't end up being sound, but the execution was right. I thought with Sid suffering from an illness and Gino suffering from an illness, they'd be slowed down against the Blue Jackets. Then what happened? Sid goes out and gets 2 goals, and the Penguins win, but it did stay under 6.5. I was right about the Blue Jackets not being able to score, so I was sound on that front. But anyway, the under holds, so I'm a happy camper this morning. Pierre McGuire, interesting conversation with him on the Mark Madden show yesterday when I was filling in. Chris Letang, Jeff Petrie. How's that dynamic going to work out? How is Petrie filling in a lot of the minutes for Letang going to go while Letang is recovering from his stroke? I talked to Pierre about Letang's situation and the on-ice ripple effect about Petrie having to eat up so many minutes.
Well, I'm just hoping, for him just to have a normal life. And if hockey can kick in and be part of that, that's fantastic. But he's a father and he's a human being first and foremost. And having known the player and the person for a long time, I just want him to be healthy. I think everybody else echoes that. In terms of what he means to the team, he's obviously a very important player. But with him out, I think one of the things we've seen is Pierre-Olivier Joseph has really stepped up the way he's been able to play, and I think that's really important. So sometimes when injuries happen, other guys get an opportunity to present themselves and compete, and I think that's something that's happening in Pittsburgh right now in a good way, not a bad way, and I think that's obviously really important. I still think they're waiting on the best Jeff Petrie they can see, and I think that's an important part of the Penguins team as well, and maybe this is an opportunity for Jeff to pick up the pace of his game. But no, I just wish Christopher and his family all the best and hope that he can be back sooner rather than later so Penguins fans can really enjoy him finishing off, the last remaining years of his career.
Since you said it, Pierre, and since you phrased it that way, I'm curious, what do you think is the best Jeff Petrie that Penguins fans can see? Because I found him to be an interesting name in conversations this offseason because when there was talk about whether or not the Penguins would keep the core together, one name came up if they decided to not let Chris Letang go, and that was Jeff Petrie. And then when they decided to keep Letang, they found a way to get Jeff Petrie too. A lot of people in Pittsburgh said, hey, that's great. But I heard a lot of folks in Pittsburgh say you can't rely on Jeff Petrie to replace Chris Letang when they wanted to keep Letang. So what should I believe is a high end for Jeff Petrie at this point?
There's a lot of high end left in Jeff Petrie. I watched him so much in Montreal. Last year in Montreal was a down year for everybody. It really was. I mean, it's just that the team wasn't particularly good. But if you go back to the season before that, the 2021 season when Montreal was playing great guns and Petrie was doing some amazing things. I mean, he's got the ability to be an excellent touch passer. He's got the ability to be an excellent power play guy. He's got the ability to play big minutes in terms of shutdown. You know, I saw him be part of a team that went to the Stanley Cup final. He didn't do great offensively in that, but he was relied on so much in terms of stopping the opposition. And in that year, it was Tampa, obviously. And I just think he's a bigger body that can skate and move the puck. You know, he's not getting any younger. There's no question about that. But I still think he's a guy that's got some hockey left to give.
All right, so my thanks to Pierre McGuire there. The Penguins get Buffalo 2 nights in a row. Then Dallas comes to town on Monday. I'll be very interested to see what the line is for that Dallas game. I bet you the Penguins are favored in the 2 games against Buffalo. That'll do it for us here on the Pittsburgh CityCast, brought to you by BetRivers. Again, a reminder, download the app today or go to betrivers.com. Tom will be in for Mark on Thursday for his podcast. Mark will be back at it with me for the Madden Monday podcast on Trib Live and his own Mark Madden podcast next week. I'll be with you all week long with Breakfast with Benz and all the way through the holidays as well. We'll catch up after Steelers-Ravens on Sunday at Acrisure Stadium. Pre-game with me on DVE at 9 o'clock in the morning. We'll catch up there as well. I am Tim Benz. Have a good weekend, everybody.